For now, we are going to turn it over to Chris Cameron, who is with us. Thank you so much for your patience, everyone, and I hope you enjoy Jeremiah's talk, or the first part of it. So I'm going to reintroduce Chris now, who is the professor of history at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. He is also the founder and past president of the African American Intellectual History Society. Chris received his BA in history from Keene State from Keene State College, and his MA and Ph.D. in American history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research and teaching interests include early American history, the history of slavery and abolition, and American religious and intellectual history. Chris is the author of To Plead Our Case, African Americans in Massachusetts, and the Making of the Anti-Slavery Movement, and Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism, which was released in 2019. He is also the co-editor of New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chris Cameron.
Thank you for that introduction, Mandisa. I'm very happy to be with you all this morning. And sorry about the issues with the schedule. I logged on 5 minutes before and thought I had some time, but I should have came on earlier. So today I'm going to share some of the research that I did and wrote about in Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism. Usually for my book talks, I give sort of broad overviews of the main themes of the chapters, but with this talk, I wanted to switch it up a little bit and do more of a deep dive into some individuals and use them as kind of a lens through which to view some of these broader themes rather than kind of discussing the more abstract ideas about secularism and free thought in the 20th century. So I'll start just a little bit talking about how I got interested in this research and sort of the origins of Black free thought in the era of slavery, but I'll focus most of my time on three key 20th century Black free thinkers: Nella Larsen in the Harlem Renaissance, Hubert Harrison, who was part of the socialist movement in early 20th century Harlem, and James Forman, part of the civil rights and Black power movements of the 1960s. So I began working on Black Freethinkers in late 2012. It was shortly after I had started connecting with other secular folks online on Twitter and stuff like that, started coming across little like blog posts and essays about some historical Black freethinkers on sites like African Americans for Humanism. I think BlackNonbelievers had a few kind of like short profiles of freethinkers as well. And as I sort of delved more and more into those, I became really excited to learn about some of these people that I knew about in other contexts, but didn't necessarily know that they were freethinkers. But I also saw that there was really a lack in terms of bringing together all these disparate essays and blog posts and things like that into sort of a comprehensive history and understanding of the main trajectory of Black free thought. So I started kind of doing research in slave narratives at first. This was based off of what I found in Anthony Pinn's edited collection By These Hands, which is a collection of primary sources about Black humanism. And he has a couple of slave narratives in there. So I thought that would be a good place to start, sort of cast a wider net than he had done and look at dozens of them. And what I found as I started getting into this research was that the origins of Black free thought lay in 19th century slavery in the 19th century South, right? And from what I knew about the larger free thought movement, this was surprising because it suggested a sort of alternate origin to American free thought, where we see among white freethinkers like Thomas Paine or Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, whatnot, that they took a lot of their cues from sort of Newtonian science, right? The new physics that came out in the late 17th century, from the science and principles of Enlightenment thinkers, right? Like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Voltaire and others. And that simply wasn't the case for the earliest Black freethinkers, right? largely because they didn't have access to these texts. Later Black free thinkers would have access to some of these earlier thinkers and would use them to important effect. But for slaves, there were laws in every southern state that said you couldn't read. So even if they got caught reading the Bible, they would be whipped or possibly worse. So they didn't have access to the same sort of Enlightenment discourses that white free thinkers had, but they did have their sort of lived experience, and they did have their capacity for reasoning, right? And they did have their ability to sort of look at their world, to analyze the behavior of other people, to analyze other people's ideas, to compare people's ideas and stated beliefs with their everyday behavior. And what slaves saw from their perspectives was that a lot of people around them were claiming to be Christian, were claiming to be born again, yet continued to keep them enslaved, continued to practice horrible physical punishments and sexual punishments and things like that, sexual assaults on their family members and whatnot, selling their family members away down south. So they saw a lot of like religious hypocrisy in their everyday lives. And for many slaves, it caused them to doubt the idea of God altogether, right? Not even necessarily just the truthfulness of one particular religious expression, right? And they didn't just doubt Christianity, but they came to doubt the idea that there was anything like a benevolent or loving God in the universe who cared about them, right? So again, this arises out of slaves' sort of everyday lived experience. Now, one thing about the era of slavery that would sort of distinguish it from later iterations of Black free thought is that a lot of the evidence comes from slave narratives and travel accounts of ministers going down south hoping to, preach to the slaves and encountering deists and skeptics and whatnot, right? We have very few people during the era of slavery who said, I am an atheist or I am, a religious skeptic. Oftentimes you see slave narratives just pointing out the existence of secularism, of atheism within their slave communities. So it's anecdotal evidence, but I compiled enough of it where I think it is significant enough to say that this is something, secularism is something that began among African Americans during the era of slavery. There are a few exceptions. William Wells Brown, famed author and abolitionist and playwright, and Frederick Douglass are fairly open about their religious skepticism and their questioning and Brown's position as an agnostic. But for the most part, we see sort of slaves talking about just the broad presence of secularism in particular communities. Now, things would start to change with the era of the Harlem Renaissance. This was a literary and artistic movement that arose out of the Great Migration to the North that saw approximately 1.5 million Black Southerners migrate to northern cities like Chicago and Detroit and New York between the start of World War I in 1914 and 1930. So decade and a half, 1.5 million people picking up and migrating up north, right? And in various cities, it leads to sort of explosions of intellectual, cultural, and creative activities. So the first free thinker that I'm going to talk about was part of this Harlem Renaissance movement, and that's Nella Larson. Now, Larson was actually born up north. She was born in 1891. She spent most of her youth in Chicago. But then she would go down south for a number of years to attend college. She left in 1907 to attend Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. And after graduating, she would come back up north to New York City to train as a nurse, would go back down south to work at Tuskegee University for a little while, and then go back to New York City. Now these various sort of, excursions of 4 years and then 2 years down south really had an important impact on her, because in being at these really sort of conservative institutions, right, they're Black schools, Fisk and Tuskegee, they're HBCUs. but they're also very conservative. You know, students there are expected to attend religious services, to dress a certain way, to talk a certain way. You know, the politics of respectability, whereby Black leaders thought that, you know, African Americans had to always display their sort of morality and their goodness in order to be worthy of citizenship and equality. Those politics of respectability were, you know, very much alive and well at these institutions. And in fact, these institutions were part of the reason that this idea of a politics of respectability gained so much currency in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So in interacting with Margaret Murray Washington, for example, the wife of Booker T. Washington, Nella Larson would sort of come to really kind of despise these politics and come to despise the influence of Christianity in African American culture. And those thoughts would really come out best in her 1928 novel, Quicksand. Now, Larson had sort of dabbled in writing a little bit during the early 1920s, publishing a few essays here and there. She would then take a job at the New York Public Library's 135th Street branch, which is now the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And that's where her writing career really started to gain momentum. She started meeting other writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, W.E.B. Du Bois, and by the end of the 1920s would publish her first novel, Quicksand, which was unique in a number of ways, not least of which is its treatment of religion and sexuality. Now, the main character in Quicksand, Helga Crane, is basically modeled off of the life of Larson, right? She's at a school called Naxos, an anagram of Saxon, which is sort of a composite of Larson's own experiences at Fisk and Tuskegee universities. And Helga Crane is sort of immediately turned off by sort of the respectability at the school, you know, having to wear kind of drab gray colors all the time, not being able to wear bright colors, but also by the sort of religious indoctrination, right? She knows that they're expected to go to chapel every single day. And the book basically opens with her having to go and listening to a patronizing white preacher talk about how good Naxos Negroes were because they knew how to stay in their place. They weren't pushing for too much, and they especially weren't pushing for racial equality, right? So Crane ends up leaving there, going to Chicago. She's turned off by religious folks, by Black religious folks in Chicago. She thinks she might be able to find community in a Black church there, and is really sort of spurned, and then ends up going to Harlem, right? Goes to Europe for a little bit, comes back to Harlem, and the really kind of key moment in the book is when she's spurned by a former lover, Helga Crane. She ends up like sort of stumbling into a storefront church and has this really dramatic conversion experience, and ends up the next day marrying a man named the Reverend Mr. Pleasant Green, and in short order moving down to rural Alabama. Over the next 3 years, having 4 children, including a set of twins. And after the 4th one, right, she's basically like laid up on her deathbed and realizing that she made probably the biggest mistake of her life in marrying Green, in sort of accepting this kind of traditional patriarchal family lifestyle, right? And also, as she's laying on her deathbed, she sort of returns to her earlier religious skepticism and affirms her belief. Believing in God not only ruined her life, but that it's also hurting countless African Americans throughout the country because it's causing them to rely on God instead of sort of taking their destiny in their own hands. Now, in analyzing and in discussing Nella Larson in my book, it presented something of a challenge at first before I got into the archives and before I got into some newspaper research, because I had to consider whether or not Helga Crane's views were actually reflective of those of Larson herself, right? And, you know, when I started reading reviews of the book, contemporary reviews of the book that came out in like 1929, 1930, I found that multiple reviewers in the New York Amsterdam News and other newspapers noted the sort of affinity between Crane and Larson. Like they actually knew Larson or knew of Larson, knew her reputation. Multiple reviewers said, you know, Helga Crane basically is Nella Larson, right? And then later on, I got into the archives at Yale University, which has a number of different collections on Harlem Renaissance authors. And I was able to find a couple of letters where she's sort of deriding her ultra-religious in-laws. Her husband was a physicist named Samuel Imes from Alabama, and apparently his parents and his extended family are were a pretty prominent sort of revival family down in Alabama, and she's writing letters, you know, talking about how much she can't stand them because of their religion, right? So we know that Helga Crane's ideas are reflective of those of Larson herself. And this novel is really important because it really broke a lot of traditions, right? This is the first novel, Quicksand, that really openly discusses religious skepticism to the degree that it does. Not necessarily just sort of hinting at it, but really coming out strongly with a main character being an atheist. And it's also one of, if not the first Black novel, especially one written by a Black woman writer, that kind of challenges the patriarchal ideals, not only of American society, but that were also prevalent in African American culture, right? It challenges the idea that the man should be at the head of the family, making all decisions, that, you know, getting married, having 2 or 3 kids is a sort of ideal lifestyle and path for women. And it shows that for Crane, this actually really ruined her life and took away her happiness. So we might want to sort of rethink some of these kind of patriarchal ideals within Black culture, but also within American culture more broadly. So it sort of helped to sort of tie together a very early iteration of Black feminism with free thought in a way that you know, is probably best expressed now in some of the writings of Sakibu Hutchinson. So the next person I'll talk about is Hubert Harrison. Harrison was one of the most prominent Black intellectuals of the 20th century, of the early 20th century, and just the 20th century more broadly. And he really represents well the ties between socialism, communism, and Black free thought during the early 20th century, for like the first 20 to 30 years or so of the 20th century. Now, like many African-American socialists and communists, Hubert Harrison was born in the Caribbean. So he was born in St. Croix in 1883. He emigrated to Harlem. He was part of a wave of Caribbean immigrants to New York City during the late 19th and early 20th century. Many were fleeing poor economic conditions and just looking for greater opportunities in the United States. That would sort of cut off a little bit after a really restrictive immigration law was passed in 1924. But from about 1890 through the early part of the 1920s, you had about, I think, 20 to 25,000 Caribbean immigrants come to New York City. And many of them sort of got involved in radical political movements in the city. Now, he emigrated to Harlem in 1900. By the following year, Harrison had already left Orthodox and institutional Christianity for good. And here's where you see the kind of shift with Harrison and with other free thinkers in the early 20th century, a kind of shift in some of the reasons why they're becoming free thinkers. I think the lived experience part is still important, right? They're still encountering, you know, religious hypocrisy, and they're still encountering ministers for example, and sermons that are like upholding the color line. So that is still a thing. But you start to get more evidence from people like Hubert Harrison, for example, who notes in a letter that he became an agnostic after reading Thomas Paine, Voltaire, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? So these early 20th century freethinkers are coming to their skepticism through many different ways, right? More than was sort of available to 19th century slaves. And you know, for Hubert Harrison, Thomas Paine was really an important example, and you can tell just by the way that he sort of participated, sort of ritual. One was a commemoration dinner that Free Thought leaders hosted in 1911 that Hubert Harrison participated in, and then wrote an essay later sort of expressing his admiration for Paine. And what he really admired about Thomas Paine, as opposed to some other Enlightenment philosophers and freethinkers, was that Paine really aimed his rhetoric at the common man, right? And he tried to write in a really accessible style so that his ideas could be spread very widely. And of course, that wasn't the case for a lot of philosophers during that time period, folks like David Hume, for example. So Harrison sort of modeled much of his own kind of secular activity on Thomas Paine, right? That he wanted to be a really dynamic speaker, and he wanted to be a very forceful writer, which Paine was, you know, probably most well known for. So Harrison saw himself as an intellectual descendant of Paine, someone who could use similar methods to bring free thought to greater numbers of Blacks. And he felt that Black people of all Americans should be in the free thought fold, right? And he said this is because they suffered more than any other class of Americans from what he called the dubious blessings of Christianity, including biblical justifications for slavery, such as the curse of Canaan, as well as churches' support for the institution. And like Nella Larson, Hubert Harrison felt that the church was kind of complicit in sort of tampering down Black political activity. But he went even further in saying that, you know, the American church is basically supporting and helping to solidify the color line in the United States. So Christianity and Jim Crow were working hand in hand. Now, at the same time that he became something of a free thought evangelist, if you will, Harrison also was a strong proponent of socialism. He was a member of the Socialist Party from the early 19 teens. And he would give speeches throughout New York City advocating socialism. And for him, socialism and free thought were sort of tied together, right? He thought that just as Christianity helped to reinforce the color line, so too did capitalism help to reinforce the color line and to support both of these things kind of supported colonialism abroad, right, especially in Africa, and racism here in the United States. So he had these sort of twin goals of both advancing socialism and advancing free thought. And he thought, you know, that they would sort of work dialectically to help eliminate racism in the United States and to combat colonialism abroad. He spread his message largely through speeches. He did have a number of writings, pamphlets, newspaper articles, things like that, but he was probably most well known as a step ladder orator, right? So somebody who, you know, wasn't necessarily packing huge halls, but was packing, you know, large parks and just open spaces, right? So you just get up on a step ladder, and his you know, he was so well known as kind of a towering intellect of the time that people would just sort of gather around him, right? So whether it's in Washington Square Park or right in front of that, you know, 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library, or in other areas throughout New York City, he would always gather really large crowds. He reviewed books in some of his speeches, including books by fellow freethinkers. And he would sort of help to advance the cause of free thought, just like some of his more well-known counterparts in the 19th century, like Robert Ingersoll. That's Hubert Harrison. The last person I'll talk about is James Forman, who was a really important freethinker of the 1960s and the 1970s. Forman was a key part of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. He would become the executive director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and worked closely with people like John Lewis for a couple of years. But then what would help to sort of steer SNCC, which had originally had a very religious orientation with the dominance of John Lewis and James Lawson, a divinity student from Vanderbilt University. Forman would eventually help steer SNCC toward a more secular perspective, and eventually become an important part in articulating and then building a Black Power movement. Now, Forman sort of broke from religion at a fairly young age, right? He had started attending Catholic school in 1935. He grew up in the South. He grew up in Mississippi. He was attending Catholic school, and this is where his sort of problems with religion started. For him, it was kind of initially as personal experiences and battles with religious people. Later on, it would be sort of reading and learning philosophy and sort of getting his skepticism from more intellectual sources. But initially, he was discriminated against in Catholic school. He was up for a prize for being the smartest kid in his class, but was denied the prize because he wasn't actually a Catholic, right? He was just in the school. And then, I think the sister, the nun would, was talking about how he was going to go to hell or something because he wasn't a Catholic. So he was also sort of exposed to what in a more evangelical setting might be termed fire and brimstone preaching, but basically just told that he was sort of less than his classmates because of his religion, or because he was a Methodist instead of a Catholic, right? But then later on, when he's forced, when he moves in with his grandmother, starts attending a Baptist church in Concord, Mississippi, he becomes even more disenchanted with religion, and eventually, like a number of other freethinkers that I talk about in the book, fakes a conversion experience in order to get off of the mourner's bench. So in many evangelical churches, you got the mourner's bench at the front up near the pastor, and it's basically a way to kind of pressure people to conform to the religious and theological standards of the community. So you go up on the mourner's bench and everybody's praying over you, right? And you don't get off of the mourner's bench until you're saved. And he saw people getting off, and he was up there for a long time, and he thought, eventually I'm just going to fake it, right? He thought I could fabricate some tears in this emotionally charged atmosphere. So he covered up his face with a handkerchief, said, "Lord, have mercy, I'm saved," and was taken off the mourner's bench, right? But you see the story coming up in a number of different autobiographies or kind of shorter autobiographical accounts, including for Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and James Baldwin. This is in Richard Wright as well, sort of a recurring theme in the research that I found. At the moment that he's supposed to become a Christian and claiming that he is a Christian, this is when he really starts to become even more disenchanted with religion. And that disenchantment would just grow as he got older, and as he started attending college in 1947. He entered Wilson Junior College in Chicago and started to sort of develop serious questions about God. And by the end of his time in college, he would drop out of Wilson Junior, then come back to attend Roosevelt College, also in Chicago. By the end of his college education, he was firmly an atheist, right? He was studying philosophy, and in one of his philosophy classes, he had to write an essay outlining what are the major beliefs that you learned from this class. And he said, the most important thing I learned from this class was intellectual arguments against the existence of God. Now, for James Forman, he wasn't just somebody who happened to be an atheist and then participated in civil rights and Black Power. He was somebody whose atheism specifically pushed him to be politically active. And he talks about this very clearly in his autobiography, The Making of Black Revolutionaries, that he feels like belief in God has hurt Black people, another kind of recurring theme in Black free thought writings, right? So he said, belief in God has hurt my people. It's caused them to look to God and to look to heaven instead of working to change conditions on earth. So for him, being an atheist wasn't just a lack of belief in God, but it's something, you know, for him, it also came along with a humanist commitment to change the world, right? And to take responsibility for bringing about political and social change. So he, of course, was very active in the, you know, more traditional wing of the civil rights movement, including as the executive director of SNCC, but then would be right there at the sort of turn to Black Power, and would actually be one of the earliest articulators of Black Power as an economic and political philosophy in 1966, and then would go on, of course, to famously do things like take over Riverside Church in New York City in 1969, and call for reparations from Christian churches and Jewish synagogues to address the many problems that Christianity, and he also included Judaism, had made for African Americans, right? And calling for reparations for Black people to be able to build their own schools, you know, television shows and things like that. So be able to basically get build up their economy, build up their communities, right? So that's all I have for today. I just wanted to kind of give a window into these three individuals, and you know, they really are kind of reflective of their broader movements, right? And we see a lot of the same kind of themes cropping up in their writings and in their works that for Black freethinkers, you know, free thought really is political, right? And there are a lot of free thinkers in the early to mid 20th century who are really trying to divorce the secular movement from politics and saying, you know, it doesn't have anything to do with politics. But for African American secular thinkers, that really was never an option for them. And their secularism actually complemented and in many cases even inspired the particular types of political activity and engagement that they focused on. So that's all I have, and look forward to hearing some of your questions.
Thank you very much, Chris. For some reason, I'm really liking the way this ended up flowing. So this is actually a really, really good segue into how we're going to close this out. So does anyone in the in-person audience have any questions for Chris? We're going to start with in-person questions that you may have, and I am coming.
Black people view this skepticism, this humanism, as secularism.
Did you hear that question, Chris?
I just got the very end of it.
Okay, yes, Mr. Ragland asked the question. The question is, how did you, for the subtitle of your book, Black Freethinkers, how did you come to use the term secularism as opposed to skepticism or humanism?
I thought secularism was a kind of broader term, right? And it includes skepticism and humanism, but also goes further in including just non-belief at all, not even just outright skepticism, but just not believing. Um, for me, I kind of use this in a similar way that Susan Jacoby did in her book Freethinkers, right? That secularism can include those who are, very strongly atheists, agnostics, but also those with very kind of non-traditional conceptions of the divine that basically almost remove divine power, right? So deists, for example, someone like Zora Neale Hurston articulated some ideas that I think fall under deism, where you believe in a God, but you don't believe that that God has any sort of agency or anything in human life. And at that point, it's basically like, well, what is the point of even believing in the God, right? So I use secularism so that I could include folks like Hurston or even Frederick Douglass also articulated some deist sentiments, as well as pagans who might, somebody like Alice Walker, or others who believe in like the earth as God, right? Which to me seems, it's using kind of divine and theistic language, but to me seems more closer to non-belief in a God than it does to sort of traditional conceptions of religion. So I just thought secularism was broad enough where I could include a good kind of range of thinkers and didn't necessarily have to kind of limit myself too much.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. So we have a question from the virtual audience. The question is, how did these folks deal with the critique that Christianity provided an impetus for Black power? Example, Dr. King and other leaders of that time.
Mhm. Um, so I'm not sure what folks he's talking about, because a lot of the secular thinkers that I'm looking at in the last chapter of the book were actually part of Black power. So for many of them, like David Hilliard, Huey Newton, Stokely Carmichael, Foreman, and others, um, they were highly critical of Christianity, and we're talking here about some of the like key leaders of the Black
Yeah.
Panther
I think
Party,
it
and
might be like some of the other more religious leaders who might have made that assertion that Christianity might have been a force for Black liberation, sort of like a
yeah,
Black
yeah.
liberation theology as well.
Yeah, yeah. So I think a lot of free thinkers were okay with Black liberation theology, but still critiqued it a bit in that it was coming, a little too late for their liking. So they thought that sort of traditional conceptions of Christianity just did not go far enough in sort of motivating people to take action, right? Now, with Black theology arising right around the same time as the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party, that was certainly welcome, and Black Panther leaders did work together with some of the leaders of the Black theology movement. But for many, I think they felt that it was coming too late. The interesting thing about Black theology, though, is that it arises right around 1966 with some of its central premises being that God is what they say ontologically Black, or God kind of identifies with the downtrodden, with the poor, with minorities and whatnot, and that God is going to be on the side of the oppressed and will eventually help bring about racial equality and justice in America. And you started to see, more kind of explicitly activist ministers and ministers like James Cone, who were open to some of the political ideas of the Black Power movement. So they're actually kind of, in a sense, incorporating some of the critiques of earlier Black freethinkers people like James Baldwin, right, who wrote in his 1964 play Blues for Mr. Charlie, who really strongly implied that Black Christianity was not doing enough to change the condition of Black people. So they're really like incorporating the critiques of Black freethinkers from the 20th century in building this kind of new theological movement, right? This trying to counter this idea that Black religion is otherworldly.
Okay, so we have another one from online. Are there any critiques or discussion of Islam in your book?
No, there aren't. So I think all of the Black freethinkers I discussed were rejecting Christianity, right? I don't have any examples of folks who were raised Muslim and then departed from that to become freethinkers. That's not to say that there aren't, but yeah, no, I don't discuss that in the book.
Okay, so we have another question. So 50 years from now, if you have this, how do you envision historians discussing Black secularism in the early 21st century?
So a couple of things are emerging. This is building a little bit off of Debbie's talk from yesterday. I was surprised to see that a lot of the Black secular respondents, or I think she said most of the Black secular respondents, were in the South. So I think with kind of a little bit of a reverse Great Migration going on, where you're seeing a lot of Northern Black folks moving back down South, especially to urban areas like, Charlotte, Durham, Atlanta, Richmond, whatnot, that that the sort of South is going to play a much larger role in histories of Black free thought, right? So in my book, what I see is a lot of folks who maybe they became free thinkers in the South, right? Or they started to question religion in the South, but they didn't ever really articulate it in speeches or in writings or whatnot until they got to some of these urban Northern spaces. So I think we're going to see a greater prominence of discussions of Black Southern free thinkers. And what else? I think we'll see sort of a much greater role of free thought within Black popular culture, right? That's something that, I'm writing a second volume on Black free thought that basically picks up where I left off in the first one, 1975 to 2020. So that's going to be a theme in the book and may even be a chapter. But I think, 50 years from now, you'll probably be able to write whole books just on like secularism and Black film or something like that, right? So it's starting to pick up bit, more, and I think it's just going to accelerate.
And that is actually a segue into the final question. I know there is a book that you just recently have released or is scheduled to be released soon. Can you talk about that just for a moment?
So I have a book coming out this fall called Race, Religion, and Black Lives Matter, Essays on a Moment and a Movement. So this explores many different sort of iterations of religion and its intersection with Black Lives Matter. I have an essay on a new organization called the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism and the way that they're sort of melding their political commitment to Black Lives Matter with their sort of liberal theological principles as UUs. There's an essay on like humanism and Black Lives Matter and other kind of more explicitly religious orientations. Book I'm writing right now is a long history of African-American Unitarian Universalists from the revolutionary period up until right about now, about 2020. And that will certainly intersect a lot with the material from Black freethinkers because what I found digging into this research on Black UUs is that many of them were indeed agnostics or atheists, right? And they didn't necessarily see that as incompatible with liberal religion, especially moving into the 20th century. More religious liberals in the 18th and 19th century were explicitly Christian, but after the Civil War, that started to change so that you could easily be an atheist and a Unitarian Universalist come, 1910 or 1920. So that's what I'm working on now, sort of not explicitly on Black freethinkers, but intersects with it. And then the next book is more directly on Black free thought, like I said, from 1975 to 2020.
All right, Chris Cameron, everyone. Woo!
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Please pick up Chris's book on Amazon, and also, what is the direct website they can get Black Freethinkers on?
Northwestern University Press, you can also get it there as well, and there's usually codes circulating. If you don't have one, I can help you get a code to at least get like 20% off.
Okay, awesome. Western University Press, everyone. Chris Cameron, once again.